Hey everybody, this is Patrick from the Poison Pen Bookstore, and we're here with another of our virtual events this afternoon. And today, two for the price of one. We have two fantastic writers. Samantha Downing is here, and we'll be discussing her new book, For Your Own Good. And she was kind enough to sign a batch of copies for us. And so I will be putting in the comments field a link to our web store if you'd like to purchase one. And then our friend Megan Miranda has a brand new book, Such a Quiet Place. And she also has signed a whole bunch of books for us. And so I will put a link to our web store for that book as well. And for those of you watching, if you have questions for Megan or Samantha, go ahead and put them in the comments field. And I'll emerge from the darkness, I don't know, about 45 minutes in, to be happy to ask any of your questions. And Barbara just got out of the car from her epic trip. And so she's standing by at home. So I'll hand it over to you, Barbara.
Thank you very much. I was just saying, I wish I could show photographs, but I haven't quite got there. This is the first time we've ever been to Arches National Park. There are 2,000 arches that have been created in all that gorgeous sandstone. And so it was amazing. So let me just flesh this out a little bit. Samantha is the author of the best-selling My Lovely Wife, her first book, nominated for Edgar, International Thriller, Macavity, and the British Crime Writers Association Awards. Amazon Studio and Nicole Kidman's Blossom Films have partnered to produce a feature film based on the novel. Her second book is He Started It, and then we've already shown you her third book. So that's very cool. Now, Megan has actually written more books than Samantha because she wrote children's books, and she's now written 5 in the adult domestic suspense category. All the Missing Girls, The Perfect Stranger, The Last House Guest, which is Reese Witherspoon. Why do I have trouble with that name? Do you have trouble with that name? I always list it. Right, Reese Witherspoon. There we go. Book club pick. And The Girl from Widow Hills. And we talked to both authors for their books last year, Samantha and Megan for The Girl from Widow Hills. And her books for young adults include Come Find Me, Fragments of the Lost, and The Safest Lives. So Megan's joining us from North Carolina, and Samantha's joining us from New Orleans, where they both tell me it's raining. And amazingly, for the first time ever, I would say that it's raining in Scottsdale while we do this. So much fun. So I wanted to ask you both, since I've had a lot of discussion with authors over the last months about the introduction of the Gothic into the domestic suspense genre, the introduction of Agatha Christie's kind of model, which is particularly, I think, pertinent to Megan's book, Such a Quiet Place. And whether, can you both define what a domestic suspense novel might be and why you think it might have moved in the direction, especially of the Gothic, if you even can define Gothic, because there seems to be no real consensus of what the word Gothic means. So Megan, you want to start?
Yeah, first, thank you so much for having me again. I always love chatting with you, and I'm such a fan of Samantha's new book, all her books, so I'm thrilled to be with you both. Yeah, I'm so bad at like defining exactly what each genre is, and I think that's what makes the suspense genre really interesting, is there is this sort of fluid movement across, boundaries, I think. And I actually was just thinking about the Gothic elements that kind of pull into domestic suspense. And for me, when I think of Gothic, the things that really resonate are like the really heightened emotions, and also like the feeling of isolation, the feeling of the past being something that's alive. And I feel like that's something that's really suited to the domestic suspense genre, which, I don't really know exactly the way to define that, but I think of it more as, the what's happening behind closed doors in our own homes. And I think even in a neighborhood setting, there can still be these feelings of isolation because you don't know what's happening next door when suddenly there's a crime that occurs. And I think all of my books and I think so many of the domestic suspense books have to do with how the past really defines who these characters become. And for me, that's sort of a similarity in both. I'm not sure if I answered how to define domestic suspense. I think it's how about you, Samantha? Do you have a
Yeah, I actually have a really simple definition for it that I've come up with. It's how I define it. I don't know how anybody else does. Domestic suspense or domestic thrillers are books where the main characters are not law enforcement, and they focus on. So it is not a detective chasing a bad guy. That is not the formula for it. And it typically centers around relationships, whether that's in the home, the family, the neighborhood, and that kind of thing, as opposed to like a crime spree type of a book. That's it. That's how I've always defined it. I think the current trend of it obviously started with Gone Girl and the huge success, and then followed by Paula Hawkins and Mary Kubica, and there was an appetite for it that is continuing to this day. And the thriller genre, I think, is really always done that. It expands, and it caters to different generations. And so I think any expansion of the genre is great, and the creation of subgenres is great. And this is the one that has come along most recently.
So if these are character driven, do you find that there needs to be an element of unreliability somewhere? If not in the narrator, at least we shouldn't know or shouldn't trust some of the characters in the book. Of course, that's true, of an Agatha Christie. If you've got a circle of suspects, in theory, you don't trust any of them. But still, I think, well, you tell me, what do you think? The reader should always be on edge when reading the book, wondering if they're being told the truth?
I mean, I think that's to kind of jump off what Samantha was just saying, which I think is such a great way to define this current trend of books. I think when we think of like the mysteries at the heart of these books and the character-driven suspense, it really is about the mysteries that are inside other people. And so I think there is that inherent unreliability, maybe not necessarily with your main character, but with all of these characters. It's almost like, for me, you're unwinding the mystery inside every different character and exploring their motivations and their relationships. And that is what drives the story forward. I think unreliability is so interesting because it's not just, not saying something or lying, but it's maybe you don't remember something, or your perspective shifts and you see the events in a completely different light. But those are the things that I find most interesting when I'm reading these books, is sort of how your perspective changes with every new piece of information. And yeah, I think, even a narrator, they're choosing to tell a story a certain way. When you meet someone as an adult, you don't just say like everything about your whole life. And it's sort of, you're exploring that in this story.
Well, I think we are all unreliable narrators to some degree. If you ask two people to describe an event, they'll probably remember very different things about it. It doesn't make either one of them a liar. You're just only seeing part of the picture. But I do think you said, should people be on edge? Well, yes, in thrillers or suspense movies, or the books, they should be on edge the whole time, and you should not know whether what you're reading is reliable or unreliable. Some narrators are unreliable, and they're unreliable from the beginning. You know this character is a liar for whatever reason, and some characters you don't know are unreliable, and those are the ones that really get you. I remember Claire McIntosh, her book I Let You Go had a jaw-dropping, throw the book across the room twist in it that everything you thought you believed is not true. And those are the kind of things that you really strive for as a writer, are those kind of, wow, I can't believe that just happened kind of a thing. Because if you can get that reaction, they're going to keep reading to see what else is coming.
I've been reading this sort of book, the mystery genre, for 70 years now. And that doesn't even make me a precocious reader. And everything comes around again. And I was thinking back to Mary Stuart, and that was a classic Mary Stuart. You would always have a girl in some exotic location, either contemporary or it could be historical, it didn't really matter. And there were always two guys. And, and the whole point of the book was which one of them was going to turn out to be the trustworthy, hero, and which one was going to turn out to be the shit. But, it was just a wonderful formula. And the reader didn't know which one to trust any more than the girl, knew which one to trust. I think about Nine Coaches Waiting, which is a classic, and other books like that. So this isn't really new. It's just kind of come around again, with a new and thinking about the Gothic and both of your books. This new book by Megan has is Gothic in a way, but it's really a classic Agatha Christie setup. And your second book, Samantha, was more like a road trip, right? You didn't have a very closely structured. So I find it interesting that you've, both explored these different kinds of, what do I want to say, landscape of the book. You moved yours around a lot. And in this particular book, Megan, which you can talk about, Such a Quiet Place, everybody is concentrated in a very structured and small community, which I have to tell you, Megan, is not that different from the one I live in. So I'm wondering what's going to erupt, who's going to die in the neighborhood. It's kind of scary. So Samantha, tell us about why you decided to do that second book the way you did it, and then segue into and give us a little summary, or however you want to do it, of your new book.
And he started it, that was a road trip book that went across the country. That was, but it was also an isolating book because they were stuck in a car together, 5 people. It's a pressure cooker. Although they had they had cell phones, they could find the internet, they still could communicate with the outside world. They were still stuck with each other and all their little secrets in that car, which was a perfect setup for a thriller in my mind, because none of them wanted to be there with each other, but they had to be in order to get their grandfather's inheritance. The new book takes place at a private school in the Northeast, which again is its own community, with its own social structures within it. Schools are very isolated places where you're not really dealing with the real world, you're dealing with what you're teaching. And there are social structures within the teachers, there are social structures with parents to the teachers, and then the kids, and all the structures are different and they have to all maneuver around each other. So again, it's the relationships with Teddy Crutcher, who is the main character and a teacher at the school, and his relationships with parents, with kids, is what comes into play in the book.
Megan, want to tell us about Such a Quiet Place, where you set it and why you set it that way?
Yeah, so if you've read any of my adult suspense, you probably know I am drawn to small town settings. Like, I love the dynamic of characters who think they know everything about one another, and obviously they don't, as a mystery or crime shakes everything up. But the way that those relationships can feel both comforting in some situations and also inescapable when everyone knows you a certain way. And for a long time, I'd been thinking of pulling those boundaries even tighter and trying to set a mystery or a thriller in a single neighborhood. And this has been something I've been saying for a while, but I didn't really have the story for it. It's like, one day I'm going to write my neighborhood book. And I just, I came up with this idea for this very small, close-knit neighborhood. It's set on a lake in the woods. And one of the things that makes it unique is that almost everyone in this neighborhood doesn't only live together, they also work together. It's in a college setting, and there's not a lot of other industries to commute to. So they all are there for various reasons related to the college. And they're also, a lot of them are home because the book takes place for 11 days over the course of July 4th weeks. And what really kind of triggered the idea for this book was, I'm a huge suspense reader. I watch documentaries, I watch true crime. And at the end of everything, when there's a resolution, I would start thinking, like, what happens next? And that's what kind of triggered this idea. Like a year and a half earlier, there was a crime in this neighborhood that shook everything up, but everyone worked together to piece together their evidence, which led to the conviction of one of their neighbors. The book begins as her conviction's overturned and she comes right back in. So it's sort of like a pressure cooker, kind of like you were saying, and there's cameras that you can see in and out of the neighborhood. So it did feel a little bit like this locked box setting that, the crime is contained within this one neighborhood, which was really interesting to explore.
Crime, I do think that the introduction of CCTV, however we do it, smart houses and cameras and all has really changed how it's changed a lot of things, but it certainly you have to take account of it when you're writing the book, but you can also use it as part of the investigation. The British have done that really well for a long time. There's an absolutely brilliant book by, I'm trying to remember his name, it'll come to me, where he tracks somebody all the way from the Chelsea Flower Show all the way across London, down into the underground and, across streets and finally up into the apartment building flats where the guy lives, all because he had a particular tennis shoe that, showed up on the cameras so they could do this whole long routine with him. And I thought, how brilliant, that you can take this technology and use it. So you do in this book. So why don't you guys talk to each other? Those are kind of the big questions I wanted to ask. And thank you for your answers. It's so interesting. Every author has a different take on, on what they're writing. And I do think it's a very expansive and somewhat slippery genre, if indeed we can call it a genre. And then, I don't like breaking up things into subgenres. I think personally, we have one file at the Poison Pen. We don't break out anything. We just put all the books there alphabetically by author, which, makes the most sense to us. But there's a real tendency to, to try to narrow things down for various purposes. Anyway, who wants to go first?
I'll go.
Okay.
I'll jump right in because I have so many questions for you because I loved this book so much. And, one of the things I find that's really unique about the stories that you write is, I think Barbara was kind of talking about this unreliability element that, you do know. It's interesting to think about what you're solving in a story because you do know certain things depending on which narrator you're choosing. And I wanted to know how you decide which perspectives you're going to show, because I think each one is so fascinating, how you see scenes from Teddy, the teacher, but also from some of the students. So how do you make those decisions?
Well, I don't plot my stories at all. I don't outline anything. So it's all just done intuitively. And I just go really by feel of whether it's working or if I'm not really grasping a character, maybe that's not the right voice or what have you. So it's a lot of writing and revising on my part because I don't really choose them in advance. And I did not for this book. And as you say, some of the books are, some of them are reliable, some are not. And the reader can tell fairly quickly which one that Teddy is a little, Teddy has his own belief system and he believes it 100%, but it may not be reality. And the parents as well. So, but before anything, I have to thank Megan wrote to tell everybody out there, she read a very early copy of this and it is her quote at the top of this book. So she is on the cover of my book and read an extremely early copy of it where there were probably a lot of typos on it.
So lucky to read it early. Oh, I was so looking forward to it.
So, but do you plot or your stories? Are you an outliner or?
I'm not an outliner either. And I love hearing the different approaches that different suspense writers take because it's fascinating. I think everyone has their own process, but we all kind of get to the same place at the end. It's kind of where the work takes place. I don't plot, but I do generally know who the narrator is when I'm starting because I do write most of my books from one perspective, from first person. And I guess what was unusual in this case was I knew the character of Ruby first, and she's not the narrator. She's the character who was convicted and comes back. And in my mind, I would think, well, this is her story. This is the one who should be narrating it. But I realized, Ruby knows what she did. She knows whether she did it or not. And I wanted to have the story told from someone who didn't know and was sort of suspicious of everyone. So I kind of throw myself into a character who doesn't know and is sort of working through those pieces along with me. And I try to see there are certain turning points I do see. So I kind of knew pretty early on what was going to happen at the halfway point. And I feel like if I see that, then I can write to that point. and then figure it out as I go from there. But do you have to then revise a lot because of this if you're not plotting before, or does it kind of just, how does that work?
I do revise a lot, and I revise as I go. So I don't do like a quick first draft and have a mess, because I don't know, I have OCD. I cannot handle that much of a mess. That is not right. So I revise as I go. So by the time I finish my first draft, that is a revised first draft. So if I do something later that conflicts with what happened earlier, I go back and fix it. As I'm writing, I drop what I think will be clues, and I keep a list of those. That's the only document I keep, so that I know which clues I've dropped, and I either pick them up later or I get rid of them if they didn't work out. So that's it. I have one file, Microsoft Word. The entire book is in that file, and then I have a second file with a list, and that's it. And I just go.
I am so excited to hear this because I feel like our processes are somewhat similar. I have an Excel spreadsheet and it's a column of clues basically. And it's the same thing. It's like you discover as you go. And it's like, I feel like the first half of a book is discovering what the puzzle pieces are. And then like, can that form a shape? What's useful and what's not? And it is sort of this constantly evolving, like, which of these work and which of these don't. But I feel like my first draft is not completely revised when I turn it in. I feel like the first half of my first draft has been reworked. And so like the first half of my first draft will take the majority of my drafting time because I'm constantly going back and changing things. And then I feel like the second half, I can write pretty fast. But I never really know when I turn it in, like how many more versions am I going to be writing to find kind of the heart of the story.
Do you know the ending when you start? No. Okay.
You?
No, never. I don't know anything. I don't know anything except just I have a character and I have a setting. Go. That's it.
I love
That's all
it.
I know.
Oh, I love
Guys
that.
are really scary. Wow. So I'm gonna infer from this that you do write from the beginning to the end, because other writers, I mean, I've talked to writers, we're the Outlander bookstore, so I know Diana's process upside down, and she doesn't start anywhere. She writes scenes, and then eventually she has to piece them all together. So the thing that takes her so long is writing all the bridging, not the actual scenes. And eventually they take a shape. She says she can see the end of a book when she knows if it looks like an elephant or it looks like a snake or whatever. And there are other writers who do that too. They start in, they write a scene or something, and then they think, okay, I'll write another scene. And then eventually you have to put it all together. But the way you write, it sounds like you start and then you keep going, revising it all till you finally get to whatever end, whether you anticipate it or not. Is that
right? And I do, and I switch characters as in this particular. The first two books were all written from a single character. This book was written from multiple points of view, and I switch as I'm writing. I know there are writers, and I've heard them talk about how they write the entire character point of view together, and then they divide it up later on who gets what chapter, but they write each character as a block basically. But I don't. I switch, and it's written in a linear fashion that way, because the story unfolds for me too. So that's how it evolves for me, the same way it would for a reader reading it, except I get to make the decisions. So
well, yeah, it would have to. I mean, if you don't have an outline, then you would have to evolve in such a way that your book is basically outlined when you're finished writing it. And it does, there's a lot of revision involved, whether you do it as you're going or whether you wait until you're done and then go back. I'm trying to remember Aaron Elkins, who used to be one of my favorite, I mean, he still is, wonderful writer. He started in the middle. I never did figure that one out, but I mean, I do think it's really fascinating, the different ways everybody's mind works. And there's no right answer, it's only what works for you. But I also think writers are superstitious. And, I think if you do a book and it worked for you, that you're inclined to use that same process again, you can trust in it because it already worked. Whereas you have to start all over again with something else, it might be completely nerve-wracking. Am I right in guessing that?
I feel like It's changed a little bit. And it depends on the structure of the story too. I think I definitely, like Samantha, I I write the beginnings first to figure things out. I usually see character arc before a plot arc. And so there are times where if I see a scene in the future, I go ahead and put it down. And to me, it's like the place I feel like my character is getting to, not necessarily the plot scene, but like thematically something I'm trying to get to, and that helps. But it really depends. For me, a lot of revising sometimes is finding the right way to tell a story. That's something I think is like sometimes I get it the first time and sometimes I don't. Sometimes I use, in this case, I used message board to kind of piece together chapters. I've written books. One of my YA was in found objects, and like I wrote a book in reverse. So I feel like my process does change every draft, which is a little terrifying because sometimes I'm like, this isn't the way I know how to write a book. But it's not the same every time. I think for my first few books, I was very like strict with myself. Well, this is the way I write a book. This is the way that's worked. And so therefore I have to do it. And I think it took a case where like it just didn't work that let me kind of gave me the freedom to try a completely different way and just jump around and see what worked. What about you?
Yeah, I always write the same way. So I don't know if it's superstition or I just don't want to mess with it. I know there's some fantastic software out there like Scrivener, and it keeps everything, because I have to scroll through everything. I will screw up everything in the first draft, even character descriptions, because I can't remember at those details. Like somebody's got the wrong color eyes or what have you. And I know the Scrivener keeps that all neat for you, so you can just look up what does that character looks like. But I feel like that's too complicated. That'll just mess everything up.
Well, maybe I was unfair to say superstitious. Maybe it's just, how your mind works,
Right.
is the way that it goes. But it's like, I said before we started, I can't remember anything if I read it as a digital, as an ebook. It just, there it goes. So my mind only works if I can actually see stuff, see the words on the page. And then I can actually go back and find things. I mean, I can still see the pages. I have that kind of memory. And that's a digital file doesn't work that way because there are no pages. It's just like a Xerox transcript or no, what was a fax. Remember they just scrolled out. Anyway, I don't have a copy of Samantha's book because I read it as a printout. But in Megan's book, I wanted to point out that there is a really nifty guide for the reader here. If you can see it, it is a diagram of the community and where they live. And I have to say, Megan, that in reading this book, I constantly had to flip back, to keep track of where everybody lived. And it was very helpful that that you did this. Now, is that, I don't recall in your last, the girl from Widow Hills, was there a map?
No, this was the first time there was a map, and it came about a little bit organically because when I turned in my first draft, I mean, my other books, this is the first time I've had a really large cast that I feel like was in every scene. Because a lot of my other books are the main characters in a house in the woods, pretty set away from the rest of town. And it's not like every scene you step outside and there's all these houses. But this book so much relies on who would see what. So much of their evidence was like whose house camera could see which character is moving in which direction. So when I turned in my first draft, my editor said, I feel like from the way you wrote this that you have a map. And I said, oh yeah, I have a map. And we talked about ways that we could incorporate it. And so in my mind, I thought, this could be a piece of evidence that the cop who lived on their street would have presented at the trial to kind of help the jury see where all this evidence was coming from and also therefore help the reader. But when I showed them the map, it was like this size of a sticky note. And it was like really not good. It's like, there were like circles for houses and there was a word that said lake and a word that said trees, and they turned it into this beautiful artwork. And I love it. Like, to me, that's what the neighborhood looks like now when I see this map.
Well, I think it's a big help. I am extremely fond of maps, but I've already indicated that I'm a spatial kind of a reader. And so I think, especially in historical novels, where things are unfamiliar, I'm always very fond of maps and turn back to them. Samantha, do you, since I don't see your book, is there a map in it of the campus, or, is there some sort of thing like that?
No, nothing like that. It doesn't, there isn't anything that it would add to this particular book in terms of the setup of it. There are cameras involved, but they're very isolated and specific and are in specific positions. So I don't think it would have been interesting to have a map of Belmont Academy, and in my head I see it, but no, there's nothing like that.
I really love campus settings. There are so many terrific books. And, campus is a closed community. So we're back to Agatha Christie again, whether, you've got your community by the lake or you've got your campus. I mean, we can think about Donna Tartt or Carol Goodman's first book. What's it called? The Lake of Dead Languages, I think, was a marvelous academic mystery. And there are many British examples of it. But, I love that community where you've also got a lot of social structure, don't you? Because there's a hierarchy in a campus that, between the faculty and between the students, and a hierarchy, the faculty and the administrators, and, and then the buildings often kind of shape how everything looks. So were you drawn to that for this particular story?
Definitely, and the wealth has a lot to do with it as well. Teddy is not a wealthy teacher, did not grow up wealthy, and he teaches kids that drive better cars than he has, and they live in nicer houses, and they have a far more prosperous future ahead of them. So first, there's that type of a relationship of how angry that can make a person, that these are your students and these are the ones you're supposed to know better than, and they're already ahead of you in life and on this successful path to an Ivy League school, and they already have the connections that they need. And then there are the parents who are paying the bills and the donors to the school, who feel like they can tell the teachers what to do because they're paying the bills. So of course they can tell the teachers what to do. So there's that dynamic. And then there's the dynamic of teachers that actually do have some wealth and that went to Belmont and have returned to teach there. And there's a structure within the teachers. So all of that comes into play in who has the money and who has the most entitlement, and how do you teach those people, and how do you tell the CEO of a company, no, I'm not going to change your child's grade, even though you pay $50,000 a year for this child to go here. It's not going to happen. You can't tell me what to do. And it was interesting. Someone told me they had a friend that did this kind of teaching in this kind of school, and the students would threaten to sue the teacher. So if they didn't like their assignment, that was their answer. That's what these kids were learning at home, was to say, you know what, my parents are going to sue you if you make me do this. So
there's no question that entitlement would really play havoc with discipline, and expectations would be dramatically different for students who are wealthy. I mean, that if you've read a lot of, as I have, Oxford and Cambridge mysteries, back in the golden age and whatever, there were people who went to college not to get an education, but it was just sort of what they did to pass the time. And it was a very different kind of a social structure, and difficult to know. I've often thought tenure came about maybe to protect teachers from entitlement. They can't be fired.
sure.
Well, you can be under extreme circumstances, but it's difficult. So, anyway, I think campus mysteries are fascinating, but I love village mysteries too, which is basically what you've written, Megan. The Girl from Widow Hills was a little bit like that too, wasn't it? The small town dynamic, but this one is so carefully structured. So what are you going to do next now that you've each done this sort of a book? Do you have, normally by the time, for those of you watching this, normally by the time we have this conversation, they are practically through their next book, and sometimes they have trouble remembering this book, which is one reason, we always moderate our discussions, because every once in a while something comes along and the author was desperate, and I know you can't remember the book we're talking about because you're so deep into the next one, or even sometimes one more, depending on how the publishing schedule works. So Samantha, what are you working on next?
My fourth book it's still in flux at the moment, so I don't have any details, but it's another thriller.
Good. Well, it's cheering to know that there's a fourth book. I mean, readers like that assurance as well. How about you, Megan?
Yeah, I have my next book. I finished a first draft. I won't say too much about the plot yet because, as I've mentioned, sometimes a lot of revising has to happen, but it's set in a small mountain town in North Carolina, very close to the Appalachian Trail. And it's a town that's become notoriously known for a string of visitors who've gone missing over the last 25 years. And it's narrated by the manager of the inn, which is set right off the trail. So it kind of went back from like the small neighborhood to like the mountain setting this time.
Ooh, it's sort of Gothic-y. It's like Jamaica Inn or something. Very Rebecca du Maurier. I love that. Because I think a Gothic really has to have a closed structure. I mean, it's the Castle of Otranto, or it's the Fall of the House of Usher, or it's Manderley in Rebecca. You can't, it needs to have that containment for it to really work. JT Ellison and Jane Ann Krentz and I have had several discussions, some of them on Zoom that have played on our website, about the Gothic and what that actually means. And is it just a buzzword for critics at the moment? They can say Gothic and we're all supposed to guess what that means, but it's like shorthand for them. I'm not entirely clear there is any firm definition of it, but I'm pleased to see it back. And I'm also happy that people have rediscovered du Maurier as a consequence, because I'm always astonished to find people who've never read Rebecca, and if I say that to you and you haven't, I apologize, but I'm always kind of like, come on, if you want to read this stuff, be grounded. And certainly Rebecca is such a classic for it. So Patrick, do you want to emerge from your black hole? I love the way he does this. And see if we have questions for anybody.
Yeah, let's see here. Yes, there is a question. Catherine asks, she says, great covers on both of your books. Do you both have any input into the cover design?
Go ahead.
Okay. So I think the Simon Schuster art department knocks it completely out of the park, and I can take no credit for it. I am often asked if I have ideas, and I'm just not I'm not the type of person who can, like, to me, it would be very literal. And to me, I love that they capture the tone of something with each of my books. With All the Missing Girls, it had the Ferris wheel, but when they were trying to describe it to me and they said it's going to have orange letters, I couldn't picture. And then they showed it to me and I was like, oh yes, absolutely perfect. And so I saw a few cover concepts for this idea. But when they sent them, we all were like, yes, this aerial view is exactly kind of, I think, the perfect feel for it. I love how it feels like you are kind of looking in at everything, but really you're seeing nothing, which I feel like is just thematically so much of what this neighborhood is like, and how the trees kind of like are covering the words even. So yeah, I can take no credit, but I love it very much.
From mine, typically for all my covers, they have sent me 2 different covers and asked me what I like. And so far, everybody has chosen the same cover. Whether me, my agent, my editor, and then sales and marketing, and it's all come down to the same cover. I love this cover because I love the juxtaposition of this really fine painting with the elaborate frame around it, and then the graffiti on top of it. I like it's creepy, but then it's got this luxurious feel to it because it's a wealthy school, and then the background that you can't really see it on the picture, but the background of it is a patterned wallpaper, a dark patterned wallpaper. So I really like the way those 2 things come together. It's kind of like that. It's kind of like My Lovely Wife with the glamorous looking woman looking at the reflection of herself, but it's in a knife. Yeah. So it's creepy. So it can be very, it can without the knife, it's a completely different book. Or in this, without the graffiti, it looks like a completely different book.
Same person also asked about titles. do you have good luck with them keeping your original titles, or are they usually changed, or what?
I was actually going to ask you that too, Samantha, because I'm so curious. I think it's such like the perfect fitting title for Your Own Good. No, I usually do not come up with, like, my first title is usually not the one that stays. This was probably the closest I've gotten. Early on in the draft, I had called it Hollow's Edge, which was the neighborhood's name. And then once I got about 50 pages in, I was thinking such a quiet neighborhood, such a quiet street. And then, as we were talking about this, we came up with Such a Quiet Place. But sometimes I've turned in books that were like, book 4, like, let's see. I found that, the first thing I come up with is usually something like tied to the theme or something very literal, but by the time I finish, it's not really kind of what the story's about anymore. The only one I did title from the start was The Girl from Widow Hills, but it was like how she was known as a child growing up. It's what she was known in the media. And so it just, that stuck through. But otherwise, no, none of them have stuck. How about you?
Yeah, I've picked all my titles. I'm the opposite. My Lovely Wife was a fluke. I needed a title, and because a friend of mine was sending it to an agent, which was how I got published, and it didn't have a title. I just called it Millicent. I always call my books by the main character name. So that book to me was always just called Millicent. And then I needed a title, and I threw that on it, and everybody loved it. So there it was. And after that, it sort of became taking like a common phrase and twisting it into something. So the second one, he started it, was, a nod to the siblings and saying that about your sibling. And then this one, I was trying to think of things that people say to kids, like it's in your best interest. It's for, and that was one of the ones. And then For Your Own Good. And that was the one that hit, was just when I said For Your Own Good, everybody said that's it. And I was, when I was still writing it, I hadn't turned it in yet. I said, this is what I'm thinking, For Your Own Good. And because it's such an aggressive statement. And so I've been lucky, but I am pigeonholed into that now. This, like, I have to take a common phrase and twist it. So like I have somewhere to start. It's just a matter of getting it right.
Somewhere in the world, Patrick, you might remember it, somebody published a list of the original titles for a lot of, famous books, and they were so far off. I mean, really, it's really funny to see, what they were originally called and then clearly overruled. Sales and marketing usually are the people at publishing who determine, based on various things, what the best title might be. But, when it's a very strange feeling to, think of a book where you're so familiar with a classic title and then discover what it was actually going to be called. I wish I could think of some of them because they were hilarious.
Yeah, there's some great examples. I remember that book that came out. Let's see, Lawrence has a good question. You don't hear this too much. Does the pressure of previous success come into play when you sit down to write a new novel? Can you just put the past aside and go forward? Do you get intimidated? How does that work? Is it a panic every time? I'm not going to be able to do it again.
Yes. Yes. Every book is worse than the last. Every book, there's more pressure, and every book is harder to write. This does not get easier at all. It gets harder with every book.
Yes, I remember my 10th book was The Last House Guest. And I remember starting it being like, I'm 10 books in, like, I know how to write a book now. And that is the book, like, of all my books, that was the hardest journey, that took me a year longer and like 5 extra drafts to find the right way to tell a story. So when I sit down to write, it's always that, like, am I going to figure out how to do this again? Like, that never really goes away, I don't think. For me, when I'm writing a first draft, I really just try to turn everything off and tell the story and try to stay true to the characters without thinking about, I think, like, expectations of, is this going to be surprising? Is this going to, feel satisfying? I feel like all of those things are things I can work on in revision. But like getting that first draft down is the biggest hurdle. And so I try to do that without thinking about, the book that's coming out, or the one that just came out. Sometimes easier said than done.
Yeah, you don't want to scare yourself. Or whoever answered that or asked that question, if you scroll back through all of our Facebook videos to, I can't remember what time, Patrick, I remember the date, but we had Dennis Lehane and Gillian Flynn do a joint event on the occasion of the 20th anniversary of Mystic River. And they talked about this at considerable length. Dennis about Mystic River and Gillian about Gone Girl. And, what kind of pressure that put on them and how they felt about other things. So, I mean, I do think it's a fascinating question. And there are authors who have been so intimidated by one great success that they hardly ever write anything again. And, others just go forward.
Gillian Flynn has never put out another book.
Well, she mentioned that. That was part of the conversation, which is why I'm recommending it to you. And I think about, what's her name? Harper Lee, who never could write anything again after To Kill a Mockingbird. And Thomas Harris never really wrote anything great again after Silence of the Lambs. At least I don't think he did. So, I mean, success can be a real two-edged if you have, some tremendous weight of expectation on you. For some people that, that's really difficult. So I also think there are one-book authors, they had one great story, and that was Harper Lee. She had that great story to tell, and somehow she could never really come up with another one, or she probably would have written it. That can happen too. Everybody assumes when we have these conversations that there's going to be a next book, and I always ask that question so the reader is enchanted and overjoyed and can hardly wait. But I'm always worried that one of these days I'm going to ask that question and the author's going to say, no, that's it. No more books. I'm done. And I'm going to go, wish I hadn't asked the question. There we are. Anything else, Patrick?
Yeah, Megan, there have been a couple of questions about your young adult work. Can you talk a little bit about the demands of both forms? I know that, do you have any ideas that start out as a work of adult fiction and kind of cross-pollinate into a YA novel or vice versa?
I have actually. So for me, I write them very similarly. I write all of my books from first person, usually from one character. And that is for me the thing that determines which type of book it is. For me, a hallmark of YA is sort of, the immediacy of something, discovering things for the first time, putting them in context with the world. Not that those things change in adulthood, but I feel like the adult stories for me are filtered through like 10, 20, 30 years of lived experience. And a lot of my adult books have to do with things that happened in the teen years or in the past that kind of come back, and you're having those two layers. So when I wrote one of my young adult books, The Safest Lies, which is about a girl, it's young adult, it's a girl who's been raised in fear her entire life. Her mom hasn't left the house in 17 years. And when I first came up with the idea, I thought at first that it was the mom's story. I actually wasn't sure. I went back and forth, like, is this the mom's story? I pitched it as like a panic room meets the science of fear type story. And I thought this is the mom's story. And then I started kind of writing like a pitch and realized, no, this is her child's story who's been raised in this environment and is kind of like emerging from that from the first time and realizing, are all these things that I thought about my past true, in the context of a thriller. And when I started writing adult books, it wasn't, All the Missing Girls was my first book for adults, but it wasn't that I thought to myself, I'm now going to write an adult book. I had this idea of a story that was moving in reverse. And when I started writing it, I realized the element missing was this element of hindsight, that it was something that happened when they were 18, but it was now 10 years later and they needed to go back into the past for answers. And it all kind of started working together then. And that's how I started writing an adult book. So it does kind of depend on the story idea.
Is there a basic length difference, whereas a YA is about what, 50 or 60,000 words?
Mine aren't that different for the most part. I'd say my YAs, they started around 70. Some of them have been 80 to 90. Whereas All the Missing Girls was in the 90s. Usually I shoot for like 80s. So they're a little shorter, but not necessarily like enough that is like the big defining feature, I think.
Here's another great question from Lawrence. He he's hitting it out of the park today. He says, this is for both of you. Do any people in your life get scared of you and wonder what on earth is going on in that head of yours because of your work?
Ooh, that's scary. Samantha, dive in
Family
there.
and friends.
No, they should worry about what I'm gonna do if I stop writing. As long as I'm writing it, I'm not doing it. No, I don't think anybody worries about that. I'm a totally normal human being. You just can't see what's happening in my head.
Yes. Yeah, I always feel like always have to give the disclaimer, like this is not my neighborhood, like this is not, a small town. It's really just the types of stories that I'm really, drawn to, and I've always loved reading this types of story. I was a huge suspense reader growing up too, so I don't know. I don't think anyone is scared.
That's a great question. It's sort of like the picture of Dorian Gray for authors, it's right. I want to ask Samantha a question, which is, I mentioned earlier that there's a movie that has been scheduled with Nicole Kidman for My Lovely Wife. So, is that a little bit scary to have somebody like Nicole Kidman about to turn your story into a film?
I think, no, it's more exciting than anything. I mean, I want to see it. I want to go see the movie. And For Your Own Good was optioned by Robert Downey Jr. and Greg Berlanti for HBO Max for a limited series. So I want to be able to sit back on my couch and watch Teddy come to life. And I hope one day I get to do that. It's exciting. I'm not worried about how things they'll change or what they'll put in and what they won't put in. I mean, it's out of my hands, obviously, and I don't have creative control at that point. So I'm just more excited to see how they do it and what their interpretation of it is, because people can see things so differently.
Megan, have you had some interest in any of your books?
So The Last House Guest was optioned for series by Dakota and Elle Fanning's production company and MRC TV. So just like you, Samantha, like I'm so excited to see how, like it's such a different medium, and I'm just really excited to see the way that is changed and brought to life. And I feel like, in television, you can kind of expand even beyond, to other characters that maybe weren't front and center in the book. So now I'm excited.
Well, limited series is a lot different than a movie. I think limited series has been an absolute bonanza for authors, and for those of us who, for readers, because it's so hard to condense a book into a relatively short film. I mean, there have obviously been some great movies made from books, but I love long form television. And as my friend Craig Johnson says, at the end of the day, there's still the book. Whatever they do to it, the book still exists. So whether you love or hate what the film treatment is, you still have the book that you wrote.
Yeah, I think in terms of just being optioned, it's a great time to be an author, because there are so many streaming platforms and they all need original content, every one of them. And so they need stuff of all genres, for all ages. Or whether or not it gets made is the big question.
Well, that's another question too. But I mean, if you're really a devoted, you could wind up with like 92 streaming channels that you're paying for, because they all seem to go in different directions. And I look at stuff and I have to pay attention to which ones we subscribe to. But my husband's getting testy about adding another channel to keep track of. So I find that to be really interesting. And I also wonder if they're going to consolidate the way that always goes, that you'll have multiple channels, but eventually somebody will start putting them together, because that's how the old movie studios were, that's how Random House was. I mean,
it was consolidated.
I don't even know how many imprints, and then it's gradually going together.
Well, it was consolidated. It was cable TV, and nobody wanted cable anymore. So now we have streaming channels. That's what we get.
Yeah, but as you say, it's a marvelous time for authors and for readers to see what the interpretations will be. I think.
Yeah.
Yep. So, Patrick, anything else?
Yeah, there's a few more here. Let's see.
Oh, good.
Wait, I just lost my place. Okay. Christine asks, how do you come up with the characters' names? Do any of them come from your family or friends?
Love that. So I try not to, and I usually just pick names that I love. Like they're, you know, I really like the names of main characters in my books, and I sort of gravitate towards them. But then, as you're expanding the cast, I try to pick names that are not too similar as well. And so some of those change, especially in a larger cast, you know, making sure everyone's name in a, you know, different household sounds different. Um, in terms of using names of people I know, so I always try like that it's no one I know. And of course, inevitably, the book comes out in print and I get a phone call and it's like, ha, 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 it's so funny that my name's in the book. And I'm like, oh no. And it's always someone in my family. And this one time, I won't say which one because it'll be a giveaway. There was I had used a name already, and I realized it like in copy edits for he ended up being the villain, and I changed the name to the closest thing I could, like a find replace, so that it still sounded the same, and didn't think like that is my uncle that I'm very close to's name. And he was like the first one who finished the book, and he's like, we need to talk about one of the choices you made here. So
Oops.
and it was just coincidence. So I mean, it happens. I have a very large family, but I always try not to. How about you, Samantha?
I prefer shorter names, 2 syllables or less, because longer than that, it throws off the cadence in the book, in the sentence structure. And I know I never pick anybody that I know, certainly never consciously. There sometimes I look up social security records of popular names in the year that they were born to get an idea, because I want the name to be appropriate for someone who's 30 versus 40 versus 50. They're not going to be named, you know, today's names that are popular are not going to be the name of a 30-year-old. They're going to be a 30-year-old in 30 years. So I do go through a process of that, but primarily short names. I really like short names. Zach, Teddy. They're short. They're easy on the page, and I'm very particular about not having them sound alike, and that they'll be distinctive, and so that especially in this book, because there were multiple POVs, I wanted you to be able to recognize the character and know which character you're going into. So when you're reading Fallon, that's a name you remember. Fallon, I remember that. So a reader will remember.
Let's see, Tempe, I think is the name, asks, she says, to both of you, I know you don't outline, but does the story stay with you constantly, even in dreams? I'm assuming when you're working, is it kind of working its own way out through the subconscious?
I mean, I think about when I get deep into a story, which I mean, so maybe not at the beginning, but by the time I'm like cruising towards the end, I feel consumed by it. You know, I have pretty structured work hours, and I like compartmentalizing, where I work in my office and I kind of close the door at the end of the day and go to the rest of my life. But near the end, I am thinking about it all the time, and I'm making notes on my phone. And yes, like I've rarely, but I think once I remember waking up and being like, I just dreamed, you know, something that was basically could have been set in this world. Not frequently, but it has happened. Yeah, definitely sticks with me.
Yeah, I write early in the morning, and then I do think about it over the course of the day, and because I have to prepare for what I'm going to write the next day, since I don't plot, so I have to know so I think about what's going to come next. And I don't necessarily dream about it that I know of, but I tell you, every great idea I've ever had has happened in the shower. And I don't know why that is, but I'll be in the shower and be like, that's it. And I need like a pad hanging outside of my shower so I can write it down or something. But it's true, when you're not consciously thinking about something, your brain is still working on it, and then the light bulb goes off. So
have you ever had the weird
running water?
The what?
It's the running water. You know, I'm serious. You know, waterfalls, running water, whatever it is, has a very interesting effect on the brain. So I'm not at all surprised that it would be the shower. Right. We've talked to authors who've had their best ideas while driving, which is really dangerous too. You don't want to be right.
Yeah, no,
Anything else, Ben?
I was just gonna ask, has any of you, yourself included, Barbara, had the experience of falling asleep while you're reading a book, and then you wake up and you're like, wait a minute, that didn't happen. So you dreamt where you left off in the book. I have actually.
Yep.
I have a tendency to replay movies in my head. I mean, if I've seen it, sometimes I find myself, not because I missed it, but maybe I wanted to come out differently or something. That's a whole nother subject about readers and viewers, who really don't like the way you ended your story and would prefer to write their own. But, that was a famous fight with P.D. James back in the day. I don't know if either of you know that, but it was a really terrible incident when a reader, another author, I think, wrote to her and announced that she could, she had a better idea for how the book should go. It was pretty thrilling all the way around. I mean, she was not a person you said something like that to lightly.
Can only imagine. Well,
Anything
sorry,
else?
esoteric question there. No, that's about it, I think.
Wonderful. This has been so much fun, and I really want to thank you, viewers. Those are some of the most original questions that we have had. It's nice to have something that is unexpected,
Right.
I think. So, and thank you, authors, for so nimbly keeping up, which has been great. It's so wonderful to have the two of you together. So let me remind you that we do have autographed copies of Such a Quiet Place and For Your Own Good. So grab one before we run out, because unfortunately the pandemic has forced us to turn authors into shipping clerks, and once is enough, but twice is asking more than we should. So when we're out, we're out. Anyway, we are going to make a podcast of this conversation, and you can tell friends who might have missed this that they could listen to it. We've had like 105,000 downloads so far of our podcast, which I find to be really, there's a whole audience, for not viewing, but listening, just like there is for books, which I think is great. And the video is going to live forever on our Facebook video page, so you can direct people to it. So thank you both very much, Samantha and Miranda. It's always a joy to talk to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for bringing me back. It's always great. Thank you.
Oh, it's been great. So enjoy the rest of your evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Good night.
Right.
Good night.
Hello. We hope you're enjoying our programs and podcasts with authors. We'd like to expand them, and your help would be appreciated. Please make a donation at poisonedpenfoundation.org. 100% of the proceeds will go to help connect authors with readers in this difficult time. Thank you.